Meeting called to order. Welcome to meeting number 87 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Pursuant to order of reference adopted by the House on June 21st, 2023, committee is continuing its study of Bill C-40, an act to amend the criminal code to make consequential amendments to other acts and to repeal a regulation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House of Order of June 23rd, 2022. We have one member with us online. The rest are here in the room in person. I think you're all very well informed of the procedures, so I will not read them all. If I need to go back to them, I will.
I must point out that sound tests have been done, and Mr. Lametti.
Positive. So here with us today to help us on our clause-by-clause study of Bill C-40, we have two from Department of Justice. We don't have the names that I have, but that's okay. Julie Besner and Madame Shannon Davies Ermith, Acting General Counsel and Director. Bienvenue. Thank you. Okay, so we will commence with the clause by clause. Yes, Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Madam Chair and committee members, I had placed a notice of motion that the committee report to the House some measures to protect Canadians. And I want to just quickly speak to that now. It was to designate the IRGC. I think all members have this motion, but it was to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code and expel an estimated 700 Iranian agents operating in Canada, number one. Number two, establish a foreign influence registry. Number three, evaluate Canada's threat assessment in light of a UK travel advisory. We all saw with some shock the travel advisory that came out, and that was a subject of questioning in question period that the United Kingdom had issued a travel advisory about Canada. And that's something that I feel that we need to make a statement on as a committee. 4, remove red tape and speed up access to the security infrastructure program to protect communities at risk. We all of us around this table represent different communities, and the risk that we're hearing from our communities is very real right now. And we need to make sure that Canada's security is up to speed with the risk that Canadians are facing. And finally, in this motion is to create an anti-hate crime task force to coordinate the protection of faith communities. And if there's one thing that, I've certainly been hearing as a member of Parliament, but I know others have as well, is faith communities are very scared right now with what's happening internationally, what's happening here in our own country, where we value the contribution of various faith communities. But many of them are worried about the future, and they have every right to worry if the Government of Canada is not up to the task.
Is it possible to receive by email a copy of the motion? It would help to follow. I received a copy last week, but I don't have it with me today. Yes, of course. Just give me a moment, please. Mr. Clerk, if you would.
Monsieur Fortin, tout le monde, est-ce
Mr. Fortin, folks, have all members received by email a copy of the motion? Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
as well?
The interpreters have not. The interpreters have just received the motion. Thank you.
Mr. Moore, over to you again.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So, again, designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code, expel an estimated 700 Iranian agents operating in Canada. 2, establish a foreign influence registry. 3, evaluate Canada's threat assessment in light of the UK travel advisory. 4, remove red tape and speed up access to the security infrastructure program to protect communities at risk. 5, create an anti-hate crime task force to coordinate the protection of faith communities. So, Madam Chair, I'm sorry. We've been talking about the Speaker today. I mean, who knows? Maybe. You never rule it out. Madam Chair, I called you Madam Speaker. I mean no offense by it. I mean, you would be a great speaker. I think you'd be a fantastic speaker. Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, on that, the reason if you remember when we had the prospective Supreme Court nominee, we had the joint meeting between our committee and the committee of the Senate. I mentioned at the time to the Minister Varani, who appeared, that I felt that you should be chairing that meeting, that it shouldn't be a professor from a university coming in to the parliamentary precinct and sitting and admonishing perhaps us on our questions, telling us what kind of questions we can ask as parliamentarians. I said at the time that I felt we have the ability to police ourselves in that regard, and we could have easily, as has been done in the past, conduct that meeting with a parliamentarian as chair. And if you remember, Madam Chair, at the time, I gave you my full endorsement that I felt, had all the qualifications necessary and the skills to be able to conduct that meeting.
Let me just say something here as the chair. Now, I'm sure your comments back then were in relation to whoever happens to be the chair. So let's not make it personal, just in case you don't like something else, something I do subsequently. So I prefer not to make it personal.
I would take it and then quote him at a later date.
But otherwise, please continue. But can you tell me what that has to do with your motion? No.
Because I accidentally called you Madam Speaker, and I should say I do reserve the right to change my mind down the road depending on how things go. But I just want to, back on the motion, I just want to quickly say, obviously Canada's our common home. It's a place we're very blessed where people from all over the world come to live, pursue their dreams. Canada is a free country, but as we often take note at Remembrance Day, freedom is not free, and we have to constantly be vigilant. We defend these values. We need to protect the freedom of all Canadians and stand for the values of freedom all around the world. Too often now in Canada, we're seeing them around the world, but we're also seeing them in our home. We see disturbing acts of hatred, discrimination, and those acts threaten those values. These incidents can include verbal abuse, vandalism, hate, intimidation, and violent acts. These acts must never stand in our country. In recent years, we've seen communities face intimidation and threats by nefarious foreign actors. We've seen Jewish schools shot at and synagogues firebombed. We've seen churches burned down. We've seen Sikhs face harassment and discrimination. We've seen innocent Muslims murdered in their places of worship. We've seen Hindu temples vandalized. These shameful acts have one goal: to terrorize Canadians. This cannot be tolerated. All Canadians must be able to freely live their lives and follow their dreams without fear and without intimidation. And the Prime Minister has to take action to stop this surge in hatred. So that is why I've moved this five-part motion. I think there's common sense. Others may wish to speak to them. It's certainly not exhaustive, but it's a five-part motion that I think would have a tangible effect. You know, as we sit here as parliamentarians in Canada, I mean, we have to look with some degree of concern when we have the United Kingdom, for example, issuing advisories, and it's kind of news to us. We need to have a government that's on top of that. We need to be on top of that. The influence that we see now of foreign actors, we need to have a foreign influence registry. And there's no doubt the IRGC has to be listed as a terrorist entity. So, Madam Chair, that is why I've moved this motion, and thank you for providing the time for me to speak to it today.
Thank you, Mr. Moore, and you're very welcome. I have a long list of speakers, so bear with me. We're trying to figure out. So, Ms. Landsman.
Thanks for having me at the committee, and I'm happy to speak to my colleagues' motion, particularly at this juncture. And I say at this juncture because I think there are many communities in this country that are feeling an increased level of anxiety and of fear, and certainly of intimidation, because perhaps they're an identifiable group. Perhaps they follow a religion. Perhaps they are a particular diaspora community, and as such, I think it's incumbent on this committee certainly to report to the House some of these measures that we have talked about over and over again, whether it's in committee and public forum on the floor of the House of Commons. That we want a place where people can come and live and feel safe, no matter if they prayed on Friday, on Saturday, on Sunday, if they didn't pray at all. This is the expectation is that Canada is a place where you can live free of any kinds of threats. And I want to speak particularly to a few things in my colleague's motion. And we've talked about this a lot in this country. In fact, the House of Commons voted on this in 2018, and that's to designate the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, the mullahs of Iran, those who have taken over the government and rule with terror. To put them on to list them in Canada, to ban them effectively from being able to organize, from being able to fundraise, from being able to recruit, because that's what they are allowed to do today. And we know that by every estimation, or by many estimations, I should say, there's an estimated 700 Iranian agents living in Canada. We also know that the government, again, including the Prime Minister, all of the ministers who currently sit within the Canadian government, voted to ban these terrorists from Canada, and yet we don't have that yet. This is a time where certainly regime activity has increased. We've had about a year and a half of the Women Life Freedom movement, where Iran certainly has exercised a greater degree of influence, particularly inside Iran and outside of Iran in diaspora communities. We know that Iranian-backed terror in the Middle East is fueling the war chests of other terrorist organizations like Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We know that they live in our community. They work out in our community. We know that the chief of police of Tehran works out at the Good Life Fitness, and actually close to my colleagues' riding over there. We know that the health minister from the authority, from the IRGC, just had a steak dinner in another one of my colleagues' ridings. This is a community that is terrorized by a regime that they left. This is a community that is terrorized in so much as they call our offices with a blurred out background in their cars, away from their homes, because they are afraid of being intercepted by the regime. Can you imagine leaving a regime, leaving and fleeing a regime to a better life in Canada, and then you have to call a member of parliament from your car with a blurred out background because you are afraid of the actions of that regime? Now, what I don't understand is that the government hasn't given any reason to not ban this organization. And in fact, as we understand it, from many who are talking around this town, that this actually went back for a cabinet decision within the last 2 weeks, and they still haven't banned this organization. So this is one of the components to make sure that we eradicate terror from our own soil. In fact, the Prime Minister in the last 2 weeks has talked about terror in this country. He used the word terrorism when talking about the talking about the shooting in my colleague's or just outside of my colleague's riding in Montreal, where shots were fired at a school overnight. And thank God nobody was hurt. But that's just a matter of time of day. And if it happened once, it can happen again. And in fact, it did happen again. It happened again just a week later. These are shootings on Jewish institutions. We see that mosques, those who are mowed down on the streets of London in front of a religious institution by a crazed lunatic, if that's not terrorism, then I'm not sure what is. Vandalism of Hindu temples, we see that. Anti-Sikh hatred in this country on the rise. Burning of churches. This is just one of the reasons that we want to bring this motion forward. Another part of this motion is to evaluate Canada's threat assessment in light of the UK travel advisory that we saw a number of weeks ago. And that travel advisory said to exercise a high degree of caution when traveling to Canada. It declared the terrorists are very likely to try to carry out attacks in Canada. And what we wonder is why nobody in our sort of within our authorities have said anything of the like. Another part of this motion certainly is to remove the red tape and speed up access to what's called the Security and Infrastructure Program to protect communities at risk. And this was the Security Infrastructure Program was a program brought in by the previous Conservative government, a gentleman by the name of Stockwell Day, who was a great minister who brought in this program. And I understand that the program there's been some tinkering around the edges, there's been some increases, and of course, because the hate has gotten higher. But if you've ever looked at that program, you need a PhD almost to apply for that program. It is a complicated program, and the terrorist attack that I mentioned in London, and one of the mosques in London is still waiting 2 years later for the funding from that program to be able to protect their communities. We have smaller institutions who don't have the resources and capabilities to be able to apply for that funding, trying certainly to get their hands on some of that funding in order to keep their worshippers, their students, those who attend their community gatherings safe, and they can't get their hands on it. So this is another measure, and it's not a question of necessarily funding. It's a question about how fast that funding flows and whether it flows at all. We want to also see this motion brings forward an anti-hate crime task force, and this coordinates the protection particularly of faith communities, Madam Chair. Faith communities who have been under attack in this country. The rising tide of attacks against hate communities are something, frankly, that cannot be disputed. And we see that from every single community. We see that from our own constituents and from our own communities that speak to us as parliamentarians, wondering, why in this country do they not feel safe? So this I wrote the letter. I wrote a letter to the Minister of Public Safety a number of months ago, and particularly after the attacks of October 7th, the heinous attacks of October 7th, and we saw a rise of certainly of anti-Semitism, and now subsequently we see also a rise in anti-Islamophobic, frankly, rhetoric and action right across the country. And we wonder why there is no coordination, or there was no coordination. And it took obviously a month to respond to that letter, and even longer to actually act on it. And we feel that it's not there. So this motion speaks to, it speaks to a number of issues, to designate those who are terrorists, that the government promised to designate as terrorists, as actual terrorists. And we have heard this over and over again from diaspora communities, wondering who is the constituency here that is being protected by the government? Who is the government answering to? Because they themselves voted to list them as a terrorist entity, ban them from Canada, ban them from organizing, from being able to raise money, from being able to recruit. Who is it that they are protecting? It simply doesn't make sense to diaspora communities right across the country, of Iranians who have come here, who have fled after the regime. This is a simple number of measures to protect our communities from the terror that has been rising in this country, from the terror that our Five Eyes allies seem to believe that is happening here, from the terror that the Prime Minister himself admitted. And of course, one of the other parts of this motion, which I haven't spoken to yet, that I will, is the foreign influence registry. We've heard time and time again from this government that this cannot be tolerated, that foreign interference, that they are doing everything that they can to target foreign interference, and unfortunately, everything you can stops short of actually establishing a foreign interference registry. And frankly, we ask ourselves oftentimes, why not go forward with this? We want to see the government work to identify additional threats. And establishing, I think, a foreign influence registry is one of those. They've continued to break that promise that they will establish a registry. This, of course, would limit the influence that foreign governments who wield intimidation within Canada, and particularly about some of the diaspora communities that we are talking about. The diaspora communities, again, that are afraid to live within their own communities. This is not a country where you should be afraid to live in the place that you moved, in the place that you fled from. I have a well-known story. I'm a child of immigrants who fled the former Soviet Union, who live in a neighborhood with many who have done the same thing, many who fled after the fall of the Shah, many who fled Iran, many who have fled the most brutal regimes in the world to find a better life in Canada. And the fact that we can't explain to them why, when these things happen in our community, when they feel intimidated, when shots are fired at a school, when fire bombings are targeted at institutions, when people are mowed over in the streets by cars simply because of the way that they look or the faith that they practice, the fact that we can't tell them that we are taking it seriously here in Ottawa, I think is a head scratcher. I think it's a head scratcher for everybody that chose Canada to move. So in that light, or under all of that, I want to make sure that that this committee report to the House that the following measures be taken, and I will repeat them, one more time for the sake of the record. That we designate the IRGC, finally designate the IRGC as the terrorist entity under the Criminal Code, and expel the estimated 700 Iranian agents that are operating here in Canada. That we finally establish a foreign influence registry. That we evaluate Canada's threat assessment, certainly in light of the UK's travel advisory that we saw a number of weeks ago. that we remove some of that red tape or all of that red tape to speed up access to the security infrastructure program, to protect those communities at risk, and that we create an anti-hate crime task force to coordinate the protection of faith communities that, of course, have been under a tremendous amount of threats in the last number of months and years. It seems like all of those communities are frankly more afraid than they were even 2 years ago. And these are just simple measures that would tell Canadians that their representatives, that those who have the power to change things for them, are at least paying attention. That the commitments that were made in this House over and over again, whether it's through votes or through statements or through bravado, which often happens in this town, that they know that at a time where their communities are facing these threats, that they know that those in Ottawa who are working for them are also taking them seriously. So I'm very happy that my colleague here brought this motion forward in committee, and I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it in the House. These are, again, 5 very simple, achievable measures that I think would increase the safety in our communities, the safety in the communities of many of my colleagues, 2 of which were at an establishment where hours later that establishment was under attack. And I know that my colleagues have taken measures through all of the resources that we're provided as MPs. But there are communities that don't have that. So this isn't about protecting MPs. This is about making sure that ahead of, particularly around holidays in many, many communities, that people go out and they feel safe attending some of these community celebrations, that they don't think twice about doing what should be allowed and should be celebrated in this country. And I want the House to talk about this because there's a timeliness to all of this, and I want those who need to make that decision about whether to send their kids to school, about whether to attend that community center, about whether to attend a menorah lighting, which I understand now is okay everywhere in the country. It's double okay in Hampstead. So I'm pleased to hear that. But all of those who are going to attend afternoon prayers or churches during the holidays, I want them to know that Ottawa is talking about how to keep those institutions safe. I frankly believe that without freedom of religion, without the freedom of movement, without the freedom of speech, there actually is no freedom in this country, and it's one of the things that we have to protect. So as much as I will repeat elements of this motion, I actually do think it's quite important to talk about in the House and to make actual policy of. These are fairly when the protection of our state, of our institutions, of the people that live within Canada, of all Canadians, no matter where you're from, where you live, or what you do. I'm not sure that this is a partisan issue, and I'm not sure why everybody in this committee and eventually everybody in the House couldn't support these few measures. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleague for bringing forward that motion.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the Conservative motion raises very important issues for Canadians, and I'm not sure we can predict the outcome at committee, but I don't see a lot of possibilities for huge disagreement. My concern is that we have in front of us today on the agenda amendments to a bill that people have been waiting many years for, Volunteers for the Innocence projects around the country and Indigenous people on miscarriages of justice. And so my concern is that we have competing important issues. But we seem to have had a great deal of agreement in this committee around the miscarriage of justice bill. We have a very few amendments that we could deal with. And so what I'm going to propose now, and if it's in order, I'm going to move it, is that we adjourn debate on this motion to deal with the amendments and then return to the debate on this motion, having dispatched the amendments.
We have a motion on the floor. I'm going to accept that motion.
Madam
Would-
Chair, don't we already have a speakers list on the
Well,
motion?
we
that
have
we're
a
dealing with?
motion. I'm going to ask for people to vote on it. But be careful, there's only X number of people that can vote on. Okay. Can you, who are? Perfect. So you're now subbing. Fair. Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. So we do have a motion on the floor to adjourn this particular debate and return back on it after we deal with C40, and I'm going to deal with that.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Just so that I can understand exactly what's being moved. So the motion was to adjourn debate and move to C40, the discussion that was originally planned for this, but then to return to this. So just
That's
for,
correct.
for my clarification,
That's the motion.
A motion to adjourn is a dilatory motion. However, when adding other elements, as I believe Mr. Garrison did, does that mean that it is no longer dilatory and there's debate? I'm just wanting to make sure that we're exactly following what the process is here.
Oh, if you'd like to debate it, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I on the narrow motion that's been moved to adjourn debate on Mr. Moore's motion, and I would simply, in the subject matter, concur with what Ms. Landsman has said. I would hope that on an important issue such as this, and I understand Mr. Garrison's comments when it comes to there are competing important things. That is certainly something that as parliamentarians we deal with on a daily basis. I would suggest that we have a host of important issues. I would, however, urge the committee that if there is in fact the consensus that Mr. Garrison suggested, if there is the ability to pass the motion that Mr. Moore had moved and Ms. Landsman had spoken about, I don't see why we can't allow a discussion of which could be brief, assuming that there is the agreement that has been inferred. And certainly I plan to be voting in support of this motion as described. I would, however, question why it needs to be put on hold. When we have it before the House today, we have a situation that continues to evolve, and I followed with great interest the circumstances that took place in the Maritimes about Hanukkah celebrations being disallowed, and then the reversal, thankfully, the reversal of that decision. And I know I plan to with the Jewish community from Battle River Crowfoot, of which some I know quite well, plan to be able to celebrate with them when the time comes. But Madam Chair, my simple request would be that we not adjourn debate on this, but rather we allow for the debate to continue, and I would suggest it won't take too long. We have, I believe there's votes that will take place here in the next 50 minutes or so, but allow this discussion to take place to ensure that prior to a series of celebrations of which affect many faiths across our country, whether that be Christmas or Hanukkah or others. I think this is prescient, it is time sensitive, and not to dismiss and suggest that there's not other important issues. But we see how the 5 points laid out here would be a small step that would allow this committee to make a strong statement, which then would allow the House to make an equally strong statement, and I would hope that we have support for it accordingly, but a strong statement to all Canadians that their Parliament, of which government and the executive of government is a function of Parliament, something that seems to be forgotten by the current individuals in charge. However, I'll not get into the depths on that. However, I think that allowing this debate to continue, I would hope that it would collapse without too much delay, and we can get this important issue moved in a sense that provides certainty to especially some groups in our country that are facing significant challenges. And if in fact, and I'll end on this, Madam Chair, I would simply say that if we're able to get back to the debate, I know I'm somewhere on the speaking list, that I would like to have the opportunity to outline how some of the stories that I've heard, and I know my colleagues as well, about how we need to ensure that our people in this country, whether you have a faith or not, regardless of what that faith background is, that we are protected, that we protect them, and that we live up to the high ideals that Canadians expect of us. So with that, Madam Chair, because it is not a dilatory motion, I would urge members of this committee to allow the debate on Mr. Moore's motion to continue, and hopefully it will wrap up organically and we can deal with it and then move on to the urgency of other issues before this committee. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Folks, I'm suspending for 5 minutes so I can get some clarity on what's happening in the meeting. Thank you. to order. And just before we start, and I recognize Mr. Maloney on the motion of Mr. Guest. I will take my prerogative to suspend again if I need to. Mr. Maloney, please.
Yeah, it's better to get it right than wrong, Madam Chair. So I'm speaking to Mr. Garrison's motion, so what I'm going to say is this. We on this side would like to vote on Mr. Moore's motion today as soon as possible, and then we can move on to C40, which is the reason we're here today, and we can accomplish not only what's on the agenda, but address Mr. Moore's the issues that he's rightfully raised in his motion. So I suppose since I'm speaking to Mr. Garrison's motion, that would require defeating his motion, and then I hope we can move without any further debate to vote on Mr. Moore's motion.
Mr. Moore?
Just to say that, Madam Chair, we don't want to thank Mr. Maloney for his intervention. We don't want to belabor the point around this motion. I knew there was a few people that did wish to speak to it, so without, I think the only change I would make to that is to say, just to allow those that were on the speakers list to make their point with the motion and then proceed to a vote.
Okay, so we're still speaking on Mr. Garrison's motion. Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is a bill that C40 that people have been waiting for many years, that I've personally been working on for many years. We're in a minority parliament. Given the schedule of the committee and sittings, if we do not deal with this bill in committee, either at this sitting or the next sitting, we risk putting this off well into the new year, and we risk losing the legislation because we're in a minority parliament. And so that's my reason for wishing to proceed before the motion. It's nothing saying that there's anything unimportant about Mr. Moore's motion or that we should not deal with it. I am not saying that at all. But I have a genuine worry, and if we actually defeat my motion and go to speakers, we will run out the time today. We will not get this today. We have other business of the committee already scheduled, like the Minister on Estimates, and we risk losing the opportunity to complete what is a very important bill. And so that's my reason for the motion. I just am restating it, and I believe that we could deal very quickly and be back on this motion very soon.
Monsieur Fortin?
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, listen, I'm inclined to think, like my colleague Mr. Garrison from the New Democratic Party, that we're here to work on C14, and that's what we should be doing. So it's an important piece of legislation. And I can't see any reason, be it a partisan one or any other, to not proceed with working on Bill C40. I think all Canadians and Quebecers would like us to address C40 in short order. That said, Mr. Moore's motion is important, and I know that we're here to talk about Mr. Garrison's motion, but they go together in some senses. But I think that we have a problem here. Now, it seems valid to my mind. The problem raised by Mr. Moore is an important and it's a substantive one, and it's of great concern to me personally and all members of the Bloc Québécois, that said. But I don't think we're well equipped to deal with it right now. Perhaps we should have planned to hear witnesses on this and dig a little deeper before we decide on the exact wording of the motion per se. So it strikes me as a tad premature, Mr. Moore's motion, even though I agree with it substantively. And I think that we need to do the job that we were called upon to do here, as Mr. Garrison has proposed. So I would support Mr. Garrison's motion at this juncture.
Merci, Monsieur Fortin.
Thank you, Mr. Fortin.
Okay. I'm going to call the vote. Monsieur Le Greffier, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Clerk.
No, I've called the vote. Nobody is on the speaking.
Well, there's
Yep, but the vote has been called. Can we deal with that and then do your point of order?
not really, because it's related to the vote we're about to take. Madam Chair, we didn't get a. I don't have an understanding from what Mr. Couric had raised about the nature of the motion, whether obviously, a motion to adjourn the meeting is not debatable. We move immediately to the vote. Mr. Garrison's motion has some detail to it about next steps after we adjourn one debate, how we proceed, and that's committee business. We're free to speak to that. So, I think if there is a speakers list on Mr. Garrison's motion, then we would exhaust that list. I don't know if other people.
Okay. As the president, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 personnes avec moi sur cette table. And I have legal opinion and other opinion that I am calling the vote right now on this question. That's it. Monsieur le greffier, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Clerk, please.
Mr. Maloney?
No.
Madame Brière?
No.
Medicino?
No.
Mr. Householder?
No.
Madame Dillon? Mr. Moore?
No.
Mr. Couric, sorry.
No.
Mr. Caputo?
No.
Mr. Van Popta?
No.
Mr. Fortin?
Excusez, oui.
Mr. Garrison?
Yes.
Okay. 2 yea, 9 nay, defeated.
So, defeated. Main motion.
Those three.
Okay. Mr. Caputo, please. Unless you took yourself off. Honestly, I don't know. You've been taking yourself off and then putting off, but you're back on, are you?
I don't believe I took myself
Okay.
off, but in any event.
Fair, go ahead.
I was prepared to. Mr. Kirk on the list, I guess. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to speak in favor of the motion. It has 5 points that I believe are compelling. First point, to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code and expel the estimated 700 Iranian agents operating in Canada. Point blank, why are these people still here? These are not people who are people who love democracy. They're not people who love Canadian values. In fact, they abhor Canadian values. And here we are, essentially sitting on our hands. The House of Commons voted on this long before I arrived. And I understand sometimes that the wheels of Parliament turn slowly, but this isn't a wheels of Parliament issue. This is a will of government issue. The Prime Minister could move and act tomorrow. He doesn't. This is a Prime Minister who, in my view, is loath to act when he should. Let's not forget that not long ago, he spoke in the House of Commons, or pardon me, he spoke on social media about a missile from Israel striking a hospital. I don't believe he ever apologized for that. Perhaps I'm wrong. Someone can raise a point of order if I am incorrect on that. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen the Prime Minister apologize for anything he's ever done himself. No, he's apologized for a lot of other people, but he's never apologized for things he did. I suppose he had to apologize for his ethics breaches. But when it comes to things like this, you should be owning it. And I don't see him do that on a fairly regular basis. Kind of like someone else to the south who doesn't like to apologize either. Interesting comparison given questions we've had in the House of Commons of late. I am also in support of the fact, or I am also reassured by the fact that Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Sweden, and the United States have designated the IRGC as a terrorist entity. I'm aware of the connections between the IRGC and Hamas. We all know what happened on October 7th. That is unacceptable in anywhere, at any time, and I would think that all Canadians would say that the attack on innocent civilians, some of whom were children, some of whom were at a concert that was promoting peace. The IRGC, we're told, had a role in that. How can we possibly say that these people remain welcome in Canada. It is mind-blowing that officials from the IRGC remain here in Canada. But again, we have police stations that are reportedly being operated by foreign governments to intimidate Canadians. Again, nothing is being done. This isn't a matter of the wheels of Parliament turning slowly. This is a matter of political will being non-existent, despite the fact that we as parliamentarians have expressed the will of Parliament in a 2018 vote and subsequent votes for this to happen. So I'm utterly puzzled. I would love for somebody who's been here for longer than me, preferably somebody from the government. We have very capable people here who represent the government. I'm asking rhetorically, but you know, somebody else can tell me. Maybe Mr. Maloney, he's a wise guy. You know, perhaps he could tell me what's. He's a wise guy. I didn't mean that in the. Anyways, I'll just move on. He's a wise man. Can somebody tell me what is going on? Am I in a parallel universe here when people who seek to disrupt our democracy remain here and we are not calling them what they are, which is terrorists? Sometimes you just need to say it. So on point one, I am in support. Point two, establishing a foreign influence registry. This is just an absolute no-brainer. Again, we belong or we live in a democratic country with democratic values, and we should be spreading those democratic values. But as a democratic country, we should also be valuing the safety and security of our own citizens. And a key way to do that is to establish a foreign influence registry. Again, where's the political will here? Where is it? We talk a good game. We say, yeah, this should happen, and it just never does. I can't imagine that such legislation would be strongly opposed. When we have things like, you know, I'm struck by what happened to Kenny Chiu, former member of Parliament from Richmond. It was obvious that there was electoral interference when he ran. We can't forget that for someone in his position, he spent potentially years. I mean, I think all of us here spent years getting to where we've got to get to. And then for there to be suspected, not even suspected, I think it's been proven that there was foreign interference at some level, or at least attempted, for us to not have a foreign agent, foreign influence registry in those circumstances is at best negligent, at worst reprehensible. Number three, to evaluate Canada's threat assessment in light of the UK travel advisory. This, in my view, again, makes eminent sense. So I believe that we should be moving on this. Why is one of our greatest allies a partnership that, in my view, we should be valuing? Another democratic country that has a global reputation beyond reproach, we should be looking at their travel advisory. Why is the UK putting out an advisory on Canada that we in Canada don't concur with? That is, in my view, something that must be addressed. Number four, to remove the red tape and speed up access to the security infrastructure program to protect communities at risk. Again, you will not have issue from me on that. And then number five, to create an anti-hate crime task force to coordinate the protection of faith communities. I agree with MP Lanceman and what she said. I don't care whether you pray on Friday, pray on Saturday, pray on Sunday, or do not pray at all. You should be free to worship or refrain from worship however you see fit in this country. And I will always stand up for that. Conservatives will always stand up for that. I saw that there was an issue that somebody is alleged to have driven their vehicle at people who were protesting on behalf of Palestinians. I denounce that. I similarly denounce people who have targeted restaurants or that were Jewish-owned. These are all things that need to be denounced. In Canada, it shouldn't matter what ethnicity you are, what faith group you belong to. Those people should be free from intimidation, free from harassment and free to worship or refrain from worship as they see fit, which is why I am in support of this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Popta, please.
I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Moore, for putting forward this motion. I think it's very important. I think it's also very timely. Looking at motion number 1, designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code and expel the estimated 700 Iranian agents operating in Canada. This has come up many times in the House, and I'm surprised that the Prime Minister hasn't acted on it yet. Even politically, I'm surprised why he wouldn't have acted on it. I've been to a number of women life freedom rallies in downtown Vancouver, 3 or 4 of them, and every time it attracts large numbers of people, primarily of the Iranian community throughout Metro Vancouver, and they're very motivated. They're very animated about they love their country, they love Iran. They just don't love the IRGC government running their country, and they're looking to Canadian politicians to support them in that. And we have certainly shown that support as best we can by showing up at the rallies and speaking and meeting people and talking with them and encouraging them. So politically, it seems like it would be a popular thing to follow through on what Mr. Moore has not put as number 1 on this motion. I'm surprised that nothing has happened about it yet. Secondly, I think it's very timely in the sense that with what happened on October 7th, Hamas terrorists attacking innocent Israelis, that the sense of discomfort, the sense of insecurity amongst the Jewish population here in Canada has spilled over. And I think that we should be doing whatever we can to support them, to show that they have a home here in Canada and that we support that we support Israel. I would point out that Israel is the only democratic nation in the middle of what is otherwise a pretty hostile region of the world for them, anyways. And you know they're a technologically advanced, industrialized nation, a country that we can trade with, and that we can support each other democratically and economically. And I think that we need to show them that support in whatever way we can. And I believe that passing this motion would signal that. I also want to just make a point about what I see as misplaced anger and frustration by a group, by some Canadian citizens in response to announcements now a couple of years ago of unmarked graves at a former residential school in Kamloops. Now, we all recognize that this is a black mark on our history, and we also recognize that churches, the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church and others as well, have partnered with the Canadian government throughout our history to operate residential schools. And I understand as well how frustrating it has been for Indigenous communities to learn about these unmarked graves. I've met with the Kwantlen First Nations people in my riding on several occasions, and I know that the pain is real, and it all feels very recent. And you know, there's some elderly citizens that live there that were survivors of residential schools, and so I'm deeply sympathetic to their concerns. But what I find frustrating is that frustration by some people in response to these historical truths was misguided in attacking Christian churches. A number of churches were burned, some to the ground. And what I find really puzzling is that many of these churches, several of these churches, were actually there to service Indigenous communities. So it was of no help to them at all. But by doing that, they're not supporting Indigenous communities at all. They're just hurting them. And I think that, I believe it's motion number 5 speaks to that. So I think that it's a very timely motion. I commend my colleague for putting it forward, and I think that we should all vote in favor of it. Thank you.
Can the vice chair move to the next person? So the vice chair can call the next speaker,
I can keep talking for a while. I missed one.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I'm next on the list, yes.
Oh, here comes. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. So first of all, I think that a lot of these things are things we all agree on. I think they're things that we've already, on our side, said we're in support of too. For example, I've already voted in the House to designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the criminal code. I think Iran is one of the greatest dangers to the world, along with countries like North Korea, in terms of Iran fomenting terrorism in the Middle East, having a horrible record abusing human rights and calling for genocide against Jewish people and the State of Israel. So clearly I support the IRGC being a terrorist entity. And if there are enemy agents of the Iranian government operating in Canada, I can't validate that there are 700 or whatever number. They should be expelled. There's no doubt about it. So I have absolutely no problem with that. We've already said we want to establish a foreign influence registry. I think that's a very important thing to do. I think it should be done on a timely basis. We constantly are evaluating Canada's threat assessment. So whether in light of the UK travel advisor or anything else, Canada would always be doing that. I strongly support that. Remove red tape and speed up access to security infrastructure program. As soon as the attacks of October the 7th happened, where Hamas, a terrorist organization, attacked our democratic ally Israel, there were threats to Jewish community institutions across the country and threats to Muslim associations and others. And Dominic LeBlanc immediately did act and created a new round of funding that removes most of the red tape and speeds it up. Most people will get answers under the new program once they apply in a matter of weeks. And it allows for security guards to be included. And it allows no longer do you need to provide 3 competing quotes for many things. So it actually was done, and I support it because we've just done it. And finally, an anti-hate crime task force. There are communities across the country. Local police often do not know how to deal properly with these issues. They need proper training, proper guidance on the criminal code. And I think we should all be working together across federal, provincial, and municipal governments to coordinate policing. So, of course, as somebody who was just in a building that had a Molotov cocktail thrown at it 1.5 hours after we left the building, once we posted on social media that happened, I understand how communities throughout this country are terrorized, are afraid. I have people in my riding who are afraid to send their kids to their schools. I have people in my riding that are afraid to go on campus and wear their Magen David, and that, again, I speak from somebody who's a member of the Jewish community and has a riding that has over 33% of the people from the Jewish community, but that's true of people in my Muslim community, my small Muslim community in my riding. The mosques are worried too. In terms of, Ms. Dillon was talking to me about how her Sikh community feels in certain parts of this country. So there is no harm in doing this. We should be doing more. In fact, one thing that I'm saying that we're missing is having administrators of colleges and universities be part of a task force with federal and provincial governments to tell them how to quell hate on campus. That would be something also that we should be doing. So in any case, to be brief, I have no problem with this resolution. I'll vote in favor of it because it's stuff that we should be doing. End of story. Thanks.
Call the vote? Call the vote? Okay.
Yep.
But all permanent members are in the room, and
Yeah, point
you
of
are
order,
not
Madam Chair.
permanent members.
The rules do permit the rules do permit members who are not subbed in to still speak.
There's no subs apparently by our rules anymore.
Yeah.
But members in good standing are permitted to speak to motions.
Yeah.
Give me a minute, please.
keep this very brief because I know that.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Point of order. Could I get some clarity on whether or not I am on the list? Because every other I am on the list.
So,
Okay.
so as a member, you can be on the list.
Yes.
The rules, I don't know when they were changed, and I certainly didn't change them. If the committee objects, you would not be able to speak. If the committee does not object, you're able to speak. And the reason is you are not a permanent member on the committee, and subs are no longer allowed. However, having said all of that, I'm now
Sorry,
recognizing Mr.
Madam
Couric
Chair,
to speak.
I don't understand your ruling.
Mr. Go ahead.
First of all, subs are allowed. Secondly, unless this committee has adopted a motion prohibiting substitution, which I doubt has occurred, if the committee has not adopted a special order to the contrary, the rules permit the participation of members, though they can't vote, if they're duly elected members of the House of Commons and they are present at the committee. If your understanding of the rules are different, I would invite you to cite the relevant standing orders or sections of procedure and practice. I am quite certain that members are allowed to speak even if they are associate members of the committee, which I am. I'm an associate member of this committee. Are allowed to speak, but they can't vote.
So here's the last I will say to that based on advice I'm receiving. Permanent members are in the room, and that is the reason why there can be no subs to the committee, because the members are already in the room. Having said all of that, I am allowing you to speak. Mr. Kubik, go ahead, please. The member, you count yourselves, you're all in.
Mr. Couric, but thank you.
The point is, if there are more members, I'm still allowed to be on the list and speak.
You're
Chair.
allowed to be on the list. The question is whether or not you get to speak. But
If the committee collectively takes a decision that associate members cannot speak, the committee can collectively take that decision. But the committee would take that decision via a motion, and there's already a substantive motion on the floor. So a member couldn't move that motion anyway. So I'll look forward to my chance to speak, and thank you very much.
that's fine. Yeah. We'll deal with that at a subsequent meeting.
So,
We don't normally have a lot more members than the committee in the room. So this is a first for this one, but Mr. Couric, go ahead.
So a point of order, Madam Chair, related to this, because I do think that we have two very important issues before the committee, both this motion and, of course, the bill that we'll be speaking to after this is disposed of. But I do, however, want to just ensure that there is absolute clarity on the rights and privileges of members of the House of Commons on this, because one of the longstanding challenges, and as a student of politics and House procedure, I'm concerned with your recent explanation as to the role of members that are not regular members of the committee. So, Madam Chair, I would challenge that ruling.
No, there's no need to challenge, but I will read you what the standing order says. What is it? Page 1026, Chapter 20 of committees. The standing orders provide that any member, whether affiliated with a political party or sitting as an independent, may take part in the public proceedings of any committee of which he or she is not a member, unless the House or the committee in question orders otherwise. The standing orders specifically exclude a non-member from voting, moving motions, or being counted for purposes of a quorum. That's all I was trying to say. Do you want me to read it again?
So
I didn't write this, by the way.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome.
It's the challenge, however, is not with the standing order, because it's not that I agree with the standing order, although I do, but your previous intervention had suggested a different interpretation of that. So I just want to ensure there is absolute clarity around the rights and privileges of members of Parliament to be able to speak, especially when it comes to important issues like that, which we are debating now.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you, Madam Chair, and just to confirm, I am subbed in. So that clarifies the specifics associated with this. We have before us what is a common sense motion. Over the last number of weeks, in the aftermath of the horrific invasion that took place by Hamas into Israel on October 7th, we have been thrust into a situation where our friends in Israel and our friends in the Jewish community around the world have faced attacks in an unprecedented way. And what we have before us is a simple opportunity to not just stand for the people of Israel and the Jewish community in our country, but to truly stand on the side of freedom, to stand up for the very rights and freedoms, Madam Chair, that we all take so seriously, or at least I would hope we all take very, very seriously. So just to recap, we have the motion here would do 5 simple things. 1, designate the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code and expel the estimated 700, let me emphasize that, 700 Iranian agents operating in Canada. Number 2, establish a foreign influence registry. Number 3, evaluate Canada's threat assessment in light of the UK travel advisory. 4, remove red tape and speed up access to the security infrastructure program to protect communities at risk. And 5, create an anti-hate crime task force to coordinate the protection of faith communities. And Madam Chair, the reason why it's important to dive into the substance of what this motion is because it speaks to one of the fundamental values that defines us as Canadians. And that is the very idea of freedom. And in that freedom, that includes freedom of association, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. I have had a number of examples where I've spoken to people of faith within the communities that I represent, where they have felt persecuted, where they have felt, and this is across the spectrum, those in the Jewish community, those in the Muslim community, those in the Christian community, and those without a faith, where they have felt a level of an erosion of the faith that we have traditionally had in the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. A fear that the Canadian experience, the freedoms associated with that, is eroding. This motion is a simple, straightforward, and practical way that we can emphasize how important we take the preservation of those freedoms in light of what has happened again in Israel, what has been the experience of far too many across our country who have faced persecution and in some cases hatred for their belief system. And Madam Chair, I would simply state, as I've spoken with a number of constituents related to church burnings, there's been a number of churches that have been burnt down in the communities that I represent. And the fear associated with those communities as they endeavor to rebuild after a devastating act that destroyed what was seen as a safe place in the community and in those parishioners' lives. It speaks to how important it is and how we unequivocally need to act. So and to wrap up my comments, I said that I would be brief, and although there is much that I would love to talk about related to this, I will simply say this. We have seen a growing disconnect between Parliament and the executive in our country. In the 42nd Parliament, more than 4 years ago, the Parliament voted unanimously, is my understanding. I was not a member then, but Parliament voted unanimously to designate the IRGC a terrorist entity. We've seen support for a foreign influence registry, and we've seen wide support for the other 3 items brought forward. The disconnect that exists between the parliamentary system and the executive of our government in Canada is very concerning, and one that I would hope all members take seriously, because that disconnect is something that further contributes to an erosion of trust that can take place that strikes to the heart of what our democracy is and the essential provisions that are required to preserve what I shared in relation to the freedoms that we enjoy as Canadians. And, Madam Chair, to conclude, this motion is simple, straightforward, it's common sense, so that we can ensure that we bring home a level of security, safety, and preserve freedom in the great country that we call Canada, and to protect those that need protection at a time when many see an erosion of trust that it can be done. Let's buck that trend. Let's get this done. Let's support it before this committee, and let's ensure that we have the opportunity before the House of Commons to ask that same question. And I would hope, Madam Chair, that every MP would stand in favor of common sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Janice? And then Monsieur Fortin après.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will take cues from my colleagues if and when they want me to pursue a particular course, but I'll make some remarks in the meantime and wait for some maybe clear direction from them. Chair, I was the member of the House that moved the original motion to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, I believe 5 years or slightly more than that. And so I am very pleased to see this motion come before the committee. It has been far too long that the government has failed to act, and that's why I've put forward actually Bill C-350 that would list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, as well as take other measures to hold the Iranian regime accountable. And I hope this motion passes, and I hope to see strong action taken against the Iranian regime, and I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you. Monsieur Fortin?
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I just wish to reiterate that I'm going to perhaps go down my own tact. I'm triply concerned about this situation in the world, this anti-Semitic acts that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, not just the last couple of weeks, but for some time, in fact. And I find that to be heinous and odious. And the same applies to the actions taken against Muslims and against all religious and faith groups. Religion should help us to work together harmoniously. And I don't want to sound like a cliche, but we love each other. We should love each other and not to try to hurt and kill each other. So all of this strikes me as heinous, and I think that we should do our utmost to fight against that kind of thing. Now, that said, I think we should proceed rationally, and even though I said earlier that I'm open to the arguments raised by Mr. Moore, I think that this is a little bit premature, and there are a number of things that aren't within the bailiwick of our committee. The terrorist list is the purview of the Minister of Public Safety. Funding infrastructure programs aren't within our area of jurisdiction either. And moreover, we haven't heard any witnesses on these issues. So even if we are sensitive to these kinds of issues as a committee, I think that we need to be rigorous in the way that we work. Now, this is a motion that alleges certain things, and therefore we need to hear from witnesses in the first place. Otherwise, all the studies that we've undertaken would be useless. all we would have had to have done in those cases would say, oh, are we sensitive to X, Y, or Z? And then we would have just published a report. So I think this is premature. We should have heard from witnesses. And I don't think that these issues are all within the purview of our committee. Now, for those reasons and for other reasons that I haven't seemed to grasp, or perhaps but the Liberals are going to support this motion alongside the Conservatives, and that it will, in all likelihood, pass. But what I'd like to see here is, even though I'm sensitive, very sensitive to their arguments, I think it is overly precipitous, and that it's incumbent upon us to hear witnesses for at least a couple of weeks. We're supposed to be here. We've been convened here to deal with C40. This isn't the kind of motion that you can just decide on in the space of a couple of minutes. It's very substantive. We're talking about 700 Iranian agents. Who are those agents? And a lot of things here that would warrant more scrutiny. And I don't think that we look very serious if we just decide to proceed without actually having gone through this with a fine-tooth comb. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Monsieur Fortin.
Thank you, Mr. Fortin.
Mr. Moore, were you on the list now?
If we've exhausted our speakers list, then maybe
Please go
we'll
ahead.
move to a vote on the motion. I appreciate everyone's contribution to the motion, though. Thank you.
Who? That's he's not. Yes.
Thank you very much. I just acknowledge, I know as a gesture of goodwill, we would hate to not have all members that are in good standing before the committee. So, Chair, with the requirement of a few seconds to do that, I would cede my time.
OK, colleagues, on procède maintenant avec...
Colleagues will proceed with the vote.
Now with the vote. Monsieur Le Greffier.
Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On Mr. Moore's motion, Mr. Maloney.
Yes.
Madame Brière.
Oui.
Mr. Mendicino.
Yes.
Mr. Housefather.
Yes.
Madam Dillon. Mr. Moore.
Yes.
Mr. Curry.
Yes.
Mr. Caputo.
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta.
Yes.
Mr. Fortin.
Est-ce qu'on peut s'abstenir, Monsieur Le Greffier?
Can one abstain, Mr. Clerk? Well, in that case, I abstain.
Yes. Okay. Adopté.
Okay. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
What would you... Yes, Mr. Moore?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In light of the time, and I know we have votes coming up, I know I personally am going to want to vote in person because I think we have 5 votes tonight. So I would move a motion to adjourn. You can move the motion regardless.
I suppose it's up to the committee to decide. It's only 5:19, pardon?
There would be a vote right away because there's a condition attached to adjournment.
But we have to vote on it. Is that what they want? Yeah. We're going to vote if you would like to adjourn or if you want to proceed with C40, I guess. We have 10 minutes left.
It's adjourning the meeting?
Yeah, so I need time to get up there, so if we stop at 5:30, that's fine. And we'll help carry you around. Thank you.
We'll make sure you get there.
Okay. Do you want the vote?
That's okay.
You
If
withdraw
we're
the
going to adjourn
motion?
at 5:30.
Okay, so I'm going to proceed with the... I've already started, quite frankly, so what I'm going to do now is... Yes, he did. Clause 1, short titles postponed. I'm calling Clause 2. Shall Clause 2 carry? We have no amendments. there's no amendments.
Because
you
you
can
still have to debate the clause.
Okay. Oh, my God. Who?
I'd like to speak on clause 2.
Yes?
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I wonder if I could just ask our officials to explain a little bit what the effect of clause 2 would be.
Justice application being considered by the minister. Currently, the superior courts of criminal jurisdictions have been hearing those applications for release pending the review. So Bill C-40 proposes that it should be the Court of Appeal that does it. The test would be the same. Currently, it's the same test when someone is appealing a conviction that the superior courts have been applying, so that part isn't changing. It's just the form, if you will.
So it changes the form or it changes the level of court that considers the
Well,
the
that's what I meant by forum, the court.
The
It would
forum.
be-
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Yes.
heard form, but it changes the forum.
Yes.
Okay. And are there what are the sort of resourcing implications of that if all of the applications are directed to this particular court, this particular forum? Can you comment on the readiness from a resource perspective for that particular court to hear these complaints as they come in, and whether that would lead to delays or changes in timeline for those making these applications?
Well, the applications would be before whichever Court of Appeal of the province in which the trial was held. So it's not like one court that would be seized with a volume of applications. One thing that was raised during the consultations is sometimes the delay, the notice that the Crown receives before a hearing is held can be quite challenging if the particular case is very, very old, like decades old, for example. They have a hard time accessing the file and preparing for a bail hearing before the Court of Appeal. So that is about the only major concern we heard about bail pending a miscarriage of justice review in the Court of Appeal. They determine their own rules about how much notice would be provided, and they can be approached as well for granting an extension of the time, an adjournment, if you will, before an actual hearing is held.
So a request can be made for an extension of time, but that clearly means that the individual involved is waiting much longer. So it's some comfort, but not as much as they would like if they're able to make that application, but they're still waiting.
It's an adjournment, but I don't have a sense that it's something like months, for example, because there's still a requirement for people to have a hearing within a reasonable period of time.
Okay, I guess knowing people who work in the justice system, I'm curious to understand, though, the requirement for a hearing to take place within a reasonable period of time comes up against what may be the resource realities on the ground. So you can say there's an obligation to have a hearing take place within a certain period of time, but if there are competing obligations that a particular court of appeal in a particular province is facing, that still is going to have an effect on the timeline. So what is the effect if there is an obligation, but there is a failure to realize that obligation?
The general rule is that the hearing will be held very shortly after the notice is received. I think in some jurisdictions, like Ontario, I think I heard it was maybe even 5 days. So when an adjournment is requested, it could be perhaps 30 days. But the general rule is that the hearing will be held very shortly after the notice is provided.
Okay, but just say that's the general rule doesn't really answer my question of what happens in the event that general rule is not. That may be the general case, but what about the particular case where that does not happen?
There would be probably even a motion for an extension, and so the courts have their own authorities and their own rules about the notice and when a hearing will be held after a notice. So I can't really speak more than that. It would be for the courts to determine.
Okay, thank you. So to understand the implications of this, that these applications will be heard by the Court of Appeal, I'm sorry, as opposed to what's the current forum?
The
right?
Superior Courts of Criminal Jurisdiction.
Okay, all right. So, this does put an additional obligation on the Court of Appeal as opposed to the existing forum that may require some significant adjustment in terms of resourcing and capacity. Is that a fair assumption, do you think, or?
I don't think it's a fair assumption in the sense that in terms of volumes, it's not like a large number of cases, comparatively speaking or relatively speaking.
And what is the reason for shifting the forum? What is the upside of doing so?
It was a recommendation that was made in the consultation report, and there was a lot of interest in adopting that recommendation among all interested stakeholders.
Okay. All right. I'll thank you for explaining that. I'll leave my comments there. I think some of my colleagues may have questions or comments as well, but I'll leave my comments there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, there are no amendments to this, and I am asking. You were? No, you weren't, but please go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I had thought that
You've got several of us going here, but.
I had thought that I'd caught your eye there.
No.
I'll be sure to do so in a more that's more obvious next time. Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I'm just curious. Sorry if I could here, I'd flip back, but look, I am curious that you know. Let me first say that it's been interesting as I've dove into some of the details here about this in the context of the larger conversation about the justice system in Canada, because certainly there is, and I'm sure as do many members around this table, and I would think from all parties as well, have concerns about the erosion of trust that's taken place within our justice system. And certainly one of the things that plays a contributing factor to this is the when a miscarriage of justice takes place. And I know that the namesake of this bill, the David and Joyce, and how it's referred to as the David and Joyce Milgaard Law, and some of the research that I've done according to that, and then also just the host of additional examples where there have in fact been a miscarriage of justice, because that is a contributing factor. And of course, we often hear in the context of as we see violent crime rates increasing in this country, as we see a host of concerns related to the proliferation of violence, and then the fact that the justice system seems to be unable to, and certainly there's contributions to that from the perspective of the last 8 years, the actions of a number of now 3 successive parliaments where the Liberals passed bills that have contributed to that, that has added to that erosion of trust. This is the other side of that same coin. Canadians have to first trust that the justice system does in fact ensure that people end up behind bars when they've committed crimes, to ensure that there is a full understanding of consequence when someone does not uphold their obligations under the law. The other side of that, which we're talking about here, is Canadians also have to trust that the justice system and the idea of, which is a unique and one of the pivotal factors in the development of our modern society, which is the presumption of innocence, and that there is the ability for somebody to have a just and due process that lends towards allowing people to, at least with as little room for error as is humanly possible, And I wish that we could look back in our history and look at a record of perfection, but we know, and evidenced by Bill C-40
point of
before
order,
us.
Chair. Point of order, Chair.
I think the bells are ringing, so what would,
You may have anticipated the subject to my point of
I
order.
just see that. What is it?
I said you may have anticipated the subject to my point of order.
Okay, so,
I'm used to it.
okay, bells are ringing. I am going to adjourn the meeting, and we will be back at this next time. Have a good evening, everyone.
And if, just to ensure that my name remains on the speaking list on Clause 2, thanks.